Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will get started in just a minute with introductions, but before we do, I wanted to invite you all to start thinking about your own definition of rigor for your context, for the classes you teach, and how you recognize rigor when you see it. So we'll keep this prompt up for just one moment for you to read through it, start thinking about it, write it down if you can. We'll come back to this later. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I am Ruth Ann Thomas. I'm the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning in the Teaching and Learning Lab. And I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Jamiella Brooks and Dr. Julie McGurk for our first event of the Teaching and Learning Lab speaker series for 2022 and 2023. The theme for the speaker series this year is really centered on the idea of reigniting the spark of learning and how we as members of the MIT community can chart a responsive path forward to promote meaningful student learning amidst pretty widespread student and instructor stress and fatigue. This first event examines how misconceptions about rigor may actually exacerbate stress and fatigue and undermine deep learning. This topic really stood out to me as I began to think about the speaker series when I thought about the MIT mission. There's a line from the MIT mission that says, MIT is dedicated to providing its students with an education that combines rigorous academic study and the excitement of discovery with the support and intellectual stimulation of a diverse campus community. As we think about what rigorous academic study is, here we'll think about how it is implemented in MIT context. How is rigor implemented in MIT context? Is it implemented in ways that ignite the excitement of discovery, in ways that stimulate students' learning and intellectual growth? Now, on a more personal level, as I think about this particular event, I saw Julie and Jamiella speak at a conference last November, as I was simultaneously fielding questions in some of my workshops that were deeply rooted in assumptions that inclusive and equitable teaching practices undermine rigor. The provocative ideas that Julie and Jamiella shared in that workshop stayed with me as I considered my own definition of rigor and how that informed my classroom practice back when I was a faculty member, and now in my approach to workshops on inclusive and equitable teaching. Now, almost a year later, conversations about the relationship between inclusion and rigor have been an ongoing presence, both here at MIT and in my sphere of work in the Teaching and Learning Lab. Now, while our series is called the Speaker Series, I think we like to hope and think about these events as the starting point of an ongoing conversation, rather than a place where someone is speaking to you or at you. We hope that this is a conversation with you. And with that, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Jamiella Brooks and Dr. Julie McGurk to create a space to interrogate the way we use or misuse the word rigor, and to consider the ways in which true inclusion necessitates rigor to empower all of our students to grow, build on their strengths, and learn. To give a brief introduction of both of our speakers today, Dr. Jamiella Brooks brings over 10 years of professional experience at the intersection of higher education and advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice through training, outreach, scholarship programs, and affinity groups. Currently, she is Director of Student Equity and Inclusion Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Dr. Julie McGurk is currently the Director of Faculty Teaching Initiatives at Yale University, where she consults with faculty and runs various teaching workshops in collaboration with the rest of the Faculty Teaching Initiatives team. I also want to thank Melissa Mangino in the Teaching and Learning Lab for all of the behind the scenes work to help make this event happen. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jamiella Brooks and Dr. Julie McGurk to Rigor as Inclusive Practice.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Yuthan. We are really delighted to be here. Thank you for having us and thank you for hosting us. Just a couple of items for in terms of how we would like for you to engage with us in this workshop. Of course, please use the chat feature. We'll be collecting questions as we go. Ruthann, do you want to mention the Slido very briefly before I go on?
Sure. So there will be a lot of interactive activities that will happen in the chat on Zoom, but we are also going to be collecting questions that you have throughout in Slido. Melissa just posted that link. We'll post it again periodically, and you can post your questions in Slido, and you can also look at other people's questions and upvote those. So we ought to have a few minutes at the very end to talk about questions, and then Julie and Jamiella also mentioned they could stay for a few minutes after too, if folks have additional questions or conversations.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so we typically like to have these be as interactive as possible, but we have a lot of work to do in just an hour. And I'm just blasting through all the various windows I have open. Of course, I went the wrong way. So with that, we do invite your questions, and we're not going to be able to answer all of them, but we hope that this is an engaging conversation, and we will have a more focused activity towards the end where we really want to get you all thinking about your definitions of rigor. If you've just joined us, we started with the question of thinking about formulating a definition of rigor for your own context and the classes that you teach. So you can go ahead and do that now if you just started. But one of the things that we want to emphasize is that we're not here to land on a singular definition of rigor. And one of the reasons that we found that was super important to us is that because we're teaching in different contexts, we're teaching different disciplines, sometimes that definition of rigor, when you can get it really focused and very specific, is going to be the best for you and for your students. And so we're not here to agree on a single perfect definition of rigor, but what we are here to talk about today are just principles around how we define this word rigor, which can be really nebulous, it can be misapplied, it can be just sort of thrown around, and we really want to take the chance to stop and pause and say, well, what do we mean by this? Why are we using this specific word? And unearthing what is in the unsaid of this term that we see so often.
Great. And so just to talk through a little bit about the goals for today, and I think Ruthann did a really nice job of sort of framing for us that this is a topic that really has come to the fore in the pandemic, because it created a lot of imperative for us to really think about sort of what do we mean by rigor, how do we enact rigor, and how do we do so in an environment that demanded a lot of flexibility and really shone a light on inequities that may have existed pre-pandemic, but we really became visible during the pandemic. And so we want to build on that experience, but then dive a little bit deeper to explore studies and examples demonstrating that rigor is necessary for an equitable learning environment, right, which we are defining here as one in which all students are given an equal opportunity to thrive. We want to rethink definitions of rigor to account for equity and inclusion, as Jamiella said, not just a singular definition, but a definition that's really going to be helpful for us and for our students. And then apply this to the context of your own teaching so that various course elements are simultaneously rigorous and inclusive. And all of these, of course, are in the service of improving equitable outcome for our students. Our examples are going to skew a little bit more towards the sciences here, but the big ideas really do transcend disciplines. And so we're welcome to everyone from any range of disciplines that may be here today. I'll turn it back over to Jamiella.
Thank you. So we're going to start with a number of principles throughout today's presentation, and a lot of these principles really target some of the what we say are inadequate definitions of rigor that really don't get us away from this question of inclusion. And one of the things that led us here is that Julie and I both have had experience doing a lot of inclusive teaching initiatives, and the way that we were observing how folks were interpreting this word inclusion were really interesting. Often inclusion kind of came with this stereotype of being softer, of being more about just the ooey gooey touchy feely part of teaching. And that's perfectly fine, but that's not what inclusive teaching is. And so we really wanted to put the rigor back into this question of inclusivity, that actually often when we're teaching more inclusively, we're raising the stakes for everyone. We're teaching inclusively as being more rigorous in our own pedagogy, in our own teaching practices. And we're also making the experience more rigorous for our students as well. And so that led us to this first principle, is that rigor, when it's defined apart from a deficit ideology, is necessary to teach more inclusively. And so that deficit is something that's really key here, because we want to focus on the ways in which we might observe or assume a deficit in our students. And this has especially been seen during the pandemic, when folks started using phrases like we've lost a lot of time, or we're really behind. And while in some cases that may be true, I think it was just an assumption that was made across the board. And that really does damage to the ways that we think about inclusive teaching and the ways that we think about our students. And so how do we understand how we think about this kind of deficit ideology? Well, one way to do is just to challenge what it is that we think about when we think about deficits. And so I don't know if any of you have seen this image before. You can just wave. I actually can't see too many people's videos, but you can just sort of wave if you've seen this image before. So this is an image from World War II, where researchers at a Center for Academy for Naval, they looked at some of the damage that were being done to the aircrafts that were returning from missions. And they were trying to gather data based on where they should strengthen those aircrafts so that more of the aircrafts would survive. And so this was brought in front of a statistical research group at Columbia, where a man named Abraham Wald, he actually said, we're actually not getting a meaningful assessment of data, because we are looking at the data from the airplanes that have survived. We are not gathering data from the airplanes that never returned. And so, in fact, in looking at this, the assumption was made that the areas that were the least damaged were the strongest, and that they needed to fortify the areas that were the most damaged. But the fact that these airplanes returned, it was actually the opposite. You needed to fortify the areas that were the areas that were most damaged didn't actually need armor, because they were the ones that, despite the damage, were able to come and return and land. And so this is a logical fallacy called survivor bias, by which we make conclusions by focusing too much on the good, too much on those who have made it through the selection process. And I would say that even all of us sitting together here in this room, we are all benefactors of survivor bias. We are all here because we have survived an inequitable system, a non-inclusive system. And so by being survivors of a particular process, not survivors of it, not because of it, we have to be really careful in the assumptions that we make about ourselves surviving what we may have had experiences with this question of rigor. And so I can imagine and think about many different examples I have had where I went through a class and I thought, wow, that was a tough class. It was really rigorous. I survived it. When I really encourage us to rethink that and say, well, maybe I survived that class, but maybe the rigor of that class wasn't what I thought it was. And so when we're focusing on these biases, we want to be very meaningful and very specific about thinking about different ways that we can look at the ways our students can thrive in the class rather than survive that class. A lot of this work came from a really fantastic article, and all the articles and things that we share with you will be loaded in a document at the end of today's presentation. So go download this article, read it, because I think it's really transformative. But it was from an educator named Craig Nelson, who started really questioning what he calls his dysfunctional illusions of rigor. And one of the things that he noticed is that the research that he was reading about rigorous environment ran counter to the ways that he was teaching. And so he realized, and he asked this really pertinent question, what are deficits, quote unquote, deficits in the ways that he was perceiving students that were actually made irrelevant by just changing his pedagogical approach? And so we really encourage all of us to be thinking about what are healthier definitions of rigor that we can use that will cover or ignore what we perceive as deficits in our students. One of really interesting interactions I had when Julie and I gave this workshop at a different institution was I had someone come up to me at the end and say, well, do you really think that this works? You really think that this prevents all students from failing a class? And I thought about it and I told him, no. I think there are many reasons why a student might fail a class. There are many students outside of that student's control. There might be some things inside that student's control that they didn't act on. But I would want to make sure that if I am teaching and I'm teaching in a rigorous and a good way, that a student doesn't fail because of my teaching. So that's what I want to get us to think about today, is that in terms of addressing the deficits from our students, in terms of thinking about the reasons that a student may fail our class, by teaching and thinking in a rigorous way that is also inclusive, we narrow the chance that a student fails our class because of our teaching practices and rather for other reasons. Craig Nelson's article looks at a number of different studies, and this study is a little bit on the older side, but we have some newer research to show. But it really illustrates something that Julie and I thought was really important in terms of thinking about what kinds of changes can be made that counters deficit thinking and really enforces strengths-based thinking. So this was from a study from Fulilov and Treisman, and it looks at the achievement of African American scholars at UC Berkeley. And they were noticing that these students, these first-year students, were failing at a greater rate than any of their other peers. And of course, when instructors were asked, well, why are these students failing? Very similar things, just assumptions made. Well, they're not trying hard enough. They're not studying hard enough. They're just not going to make it. This was questioned because Treisman went and he looked at the data and he realized that these African American students were often in the top of their math classes before they got to Berkeley. And so instead, he did some more research and he found out what the students who were succeeding were doing. They were forming study groups. They were going off and getting old exams. They were doing certain things that allowed them to succeed in the course, whereas the African American students were going off by themselves and studying and thinking, I just need to study harder, be very focused, and ignoring the other pieces that allowed for success in that math class. What did he do? Instead of creating something remedial, which I think is often an instinct, let's make it just a remedial math class to get these students back up to par, Treisman saw the strengths in these students and he instead created an honors program, the Mathematics Workshop Honors Program. And through this program, they were instead taught some of the skills and the study skills that would allow for them to succeed in the course, while also building up a community of scholars among these students. And so you can see in the data here that the students who did not participate in the Mathematics Workshop Honors Program had a continued withdrawal, or fail rate that just persisted high in the numbers. But those who did participate in the program had there's just a greater drop in terms of the students who were either failing or withdrawing from the course.
All right, and so as Jamiella mentioned, the Treisman study was done quite a while ago, but since that time, there have been many studies to confirm these results. And here we're just going to highlight one more that's a more recent study and actually a much bigger study. So this was a large longitudinal study from 46 four-year institutions in the US. And so Culver et al., the first thing that they did, and what we really appreciate about this study, is to question the inadequacy of certain definitions of rigor, right? Particularly those related to workload, right? So how much the students were reading, how many hours of studying or working on assignments were they doing? Those sorts of definitions of rigor can lead to a deficit thinking, right? So if a student has to work and can't keep up with a heavy workload, we may think there's a deficit in the student, right? It might be other factors. They're still working on some of the skills that they need to do that heavy load. There may be accessibility issues. There may be family issues coming up, right? And so lots of different things that could lead to a student struggling when we're really focusing on heavy workload. So instead, the study used the definition of rigor that focused on, and is quoted here, higher order understanding of course content expected by assignments and in-class practices. And when they used that definition and looked at outcomes, they found that academic rigor was correlated with a need for cognition, so students really enjoying the challenges of our classes, positive attitude toward literacy, so really appreciating the skills and ideas of our disciplines, and critical thinking. And they particularly found this for fourth-year students. But I also want to highlight the fact that even by the first year, they saw effects, particularly on the need for cognition and positive attitude toward literacy, and had an especially strong effect on students with lower incoming ACT scores, right? Students who may otherwise have been viewed through a deficit lens, maybe even put into a remedial class. But this study shows that if we have rigor, even in those first year classes, and here we're defining that as sort of the higher level understandings of our disciplines, that can have positive learning outcomes for our students. And so I hope that these two studies together give us a sense of sort of our first principle of why we need to define rigor apart from the deficit mindset. And so moving on to principle 2, as we think about these inadequate definitions of rigor and how they produce poor learning outcomes, we have to acknowledge that it particularly does so for underrepresented and underserved students. And the fact that Craig Nelson and Culver et al. Took the time to really define rigor is important, because the current discourse around rigor either fails to do it well or focuses on the components that are really ill-defined, where it's vague and filled with misconceptions and untested assumptions, right? And there's even some calls like, let's get rid of rigor, let's get rid of this term altogether. But we want to argue that simply getting rid of the term rigor does nothing to address the inequities of the deficit ideology. And so by throwing out the word, we're allowing the deficit ideology to continue, and we could phrase it differently of saying students simply aren't working hard enough, thinking critically enough, they're just not prepared enough, right? And so we want to think about sort of redefining it and thinking about sort of what is the effect if we do not do so. And so I'm going to walk through just a couple examples to help us think about this and why this is important. And so in this first example, I want to think about sort of how inadequate definitions of rigor lead us to use weak evidence of learning. And the example I want to use is grade distributions as evidence of being rigorous, right? And so for this, we're using a definition of rigor that really is about rigor being hard, right? And it is true that rigor is hard. And if something is hard or challenging, we would expect that not everyone can achieve to the same level. And so it's this rationale that leads many of us to turn to looking at grade distributions as evidence of rigor, right? The assumption is that a nice wide bell curve means that we've been rigorous. And it's often presumed that, if students aren't failing, we're not being rigorous enough, or looking at from the other side, if all the students are doing well, that there's some sort of grade inflation going on. But, without actually looking at the evidence as to why the grades are distributed that way, I think we can't make a conclusion either way, right? And so just to highlight this, as I was talking through this, you were probably thinking that what you're looking at right here is an idealized grade curve, but actually what you're looking at is a distribution of heights in the population. And the purpose of showing you this is to demonstrate how arbitrary our standards could potentially be to get this sort of idealized outcome of rigor, right? So if we're only using grade distributions as our evidence, we could grade our students simply based on height and get that outcome, right? And I think we can all see how very inequitable that would be, right? But if we're only using grade distribution as our evidence of rigor, we may be allowing other inequities to undergird the separation of grades instead of that rigorous thinking that we say that we want. So it might not be height, but it might be some of the other things that we mentioned, right? That we're just asking for a lot of time, that we're asking students sort of work on their own and sort of bang their heads on the wall on their own, those sorts of things, right? But embedded in sort of a good definition of rigor, we need to sort of acknowledge these inequities, right? And so we want to begin to think about grading schemes that align with standards and standards that line up with our definition of rigor and these deeper levels of thinking that we're thinking about in our definitions. We also want to account for inequities in that, right? And consider who may we be privileging or disadvantaging by the standards that we are using and the things that we're asking our students to do. And so really trying to think critically about that before just taking that grade distribution as evidence of being rigorous. And so this was an example of how inadequate definitions of rigor lead us astray in sort of the evidence. Here, I'm going to give an example of how an inadequate definition of rigor can make it so that we're setting a deficit tone in our class, which can have a strong psychological effect on students by sending a message that we see them through a deficit lens, right? And this sort of messaging can impact learning outcomes for all of our students, but can have a differential impact on students who may already be worried that we may see them through a deficit lens. And so the paper cited here, titled Psychological Insights for Improved Physics Teaching, talks about many of the ways that stereotypes and instructor messaging can impact student performance in classes. And it includes a review of things like stereotype threat, growth mindset, belonging, and understanding these sorts of psychological phenomena can help us to better understand the importance of defining rigor apart from a deficit ideology. And we don't have time to really dig into all of those here today, but many of those concepts that I listed off really point to the idea that if we set a deficit tone or communicate that we see students through a deficit lens, that has a strong impact on our students, and particularly for students who have been traditionally excluded or marginalized in our disciplines. This paper starts with some really nice anecdotes of faculty who are trying to be inclusive, but coming a bit short. And I thought these were really nice to start digging in and thinking about sort of how can a reframing of our ideas of rigor change the way that we're approaching our class, right? And so in this first anecdote, Professor Smith is concerned about the high failure rate in her introductory physics course. To encourage students to work harder, she starts the first class by telling the students how difficult the course is and that usually about 30% of the students fail. They must study hard, particularly if they think that their background preparation is weak, right? And so for this professor, you know, we see sort of a defining rigor as being hard, right? Similar to the previous example we talked through. And not sort of linking this notion of hard to any sort of standards, right? It's just hard. And that there's sort of a communication that student failure is inevitable, right? The definition is also related to what you're already coming in with in the class, right? Pointing to preparation as a major determinant of student success and not sort of defining a path to success, right? And this is really focusing in on sort of student deficits and not student strengths. And so instead of thinking about sort of what are students good at and trying to make connections for students about sort of here are the things that you're good at and how is this related to this class, just sort of starting out with thinking about sort of deficit and preparation in a particular sort of way that our disciplines may be defining it. For the second example, Professor Doe wants all students to feel encouraged and capable in a class. So whenever a student asks a question or offers a comment, he says it is a great question or comment. He is particularly enthusiastic if the student is a woman or a person of color. Whenever he critiques students' homework, particularly the work of women and minorities, he prefaces it with "good job, but," right? And so for this professor, they're definitely defining rigor separately from inclusion, right? And I think this is the opposite of what Jamiella and I are sort of arguing, that rigor is an important piece of inclusion, but instead thinking about this as something sort of additive, sort of the nicety that Jamiella was referencing before, of saying nice platitudes about great, good job, things like that, right? And this is very much undermined when you end up saying but, right? And focusing in then on the weaknesses, right? And again, this is not a strength space. If we're only saying specific things about what the students are doing wrong and not specific things about what the students are doing well, again, that's sort of reinforcing that deficit. And then also seeing rigor as something that, you know, women and students of color should be buffered from by this encouragement, right? That, you know, I want you to do well. And I want to add these niceties, these platitudes to encourage you to do well. But what it ended up doing is creating sort of a differential treatment of these students and actually singling these students out to say that I think you won't succeed, and that's why I have to buffer these comments in this way. So, you know, again, these are different ways that these inadequate definitions of rigor can have a negative effect, particularly in sort of setting a tone of deficit or communicating to students that we sort of see them through a deficit lens.
So this leads us to our third and last principle, which is this idea that rigor is not simply hard for the sake of being hard, but it is purposeful and transparent. And we find this to be a very important key to this as well, for those reasons that Julie was citing, which is it's not that we don't want to give our students critique. We want to do that, but we want to do it very intentionally, and we want to make what is opaque more transparent to the student process. So that could be really in our grading process. And so how we grade, making that more transparent to students so they understand where their grades are coming from, instead of something that seems or feels arbitrary. It also can be some aspect of making what we call the hidden curriculum more visible. So what does it mean to be a student? What does it mean to study? What does it mean to read? All of these things are words and terms that we use, that we imply something when we use them, but sometimes it's not as transparent as we would like it to be. And by doing that, we make our courses more accessible for students who don't see themselves in the classroom. They may not see themselves in the curriculum. They may not see themselves in the discipline. But when we make these aspects of the course more purposeful and transparent, we say and send the message like, you belong in this discipline. You belong as a thinker alongside your peers. And so you may be wondering now, okay, how can we do all of this? Hopefully you have more questions than answers. And so we do want you, as you develop your own definitions of rigor, to be thinking about your specific courses and contexts. But we thought it would also be useful to give you a little bit of language of others who have been thinking about this question. This is from an article in Inside Higher Ed, where this dean of students, Matt Reed, asked readers to respond on what they think rigor is. And so we pulled some pieces from it. We still think that they're a little less than adequate. They're getting closer there, but they're still not tied to specific courses or specific contexts. So it's almost there, but we think that this language might help you as you think about your own definitions. And so someone said, it's something that's academically, intellectually, and personally challenging. And that's a great place to start in thinking about what's personally challenging for one student may not be the same for another. So getting that student to come up with their own ways in which they want to be challenged in that course. Thinking about encouraging students to question assumptions and think deeply. And so that could be formulated in the ways that questions are designed, the questions or worksheets that they're working on, so that they're looking at things that they may be assuming about the world or about the content. It's more than just memorization and information recall. Going back to that critical thinking piece that Julie mentioned, it's also the ability to receive and give critique on your own and others' work, so that we may need to scaffold that process. I think that students are actually harder on each other than we are on them often, because we know what it looks like and what it takes to encounter something for the very first time. And so really being able to scaffold the process of thinking about how do you critique others in a way that is meaningful, that is purposeful, but that also communicates ways that they can improve. And then just these series of words, it's concrete, it's specific, it's intentional, it's reflective, it's precise, and it's transparent. I think it's also useful to think about the ways in which what rigor should not be. So the opposite of that question. So it's really not a shield to criticism. For example, praising the fact that you have low success rates. So that must mean you're more rigorous. So going back to the drop, fail, withdrawal rate, that might have been a sign of we're doing great because all of these students are failing, and really thinking about we're not doing great because all of these students are failing. How can we make this process more intentionally rigorous so that students can succeed in the class? It also should not be a mechanism for training students to be irresponsibly dependent on authority. So I think this goes back to just memorizing information recall and this regurgitating things that they learn back to us. We really want them to be critical thinkers, and so we want them to critique things. And a great first example of this might be giving them 2 papers on the same thing, and the 2 papers come with 2 different conclusions on the same topic, and getting students to engage and debate on how did they come to those answers, and why do they think they have come to the conclusions that they did. And then finally, opaque or illegible expectations rather than high ones. And so high expectations are communicated in very specific ways. I see this work that you're doing. I think you can do better. Here are the ways that you can do it. Are ways that we can really make that process more transparent and therefore more accessible, rather than reducing our expectations, in which case that sends a message of non-inclusivity. When we reduce our expectations or communicate lowered expectations, that really sends a message to students like, I don't actually think you can do this. And sometimes that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So here are 3 principles here again. And we are going to now transition into a more interactive piece because we really want to hear from all of you on what kinds of thoughts you have, what kinds of definitions you've come up with. So our 3 principles here are: rigor, when defined apart from deficit ideology, is necessary in order to teach inclusively. We need to question our definitions of rigor to make sure that they are adequate and up for the task. And then we also need to be thinking about rigor not just being hard for the sake of it, but being purposeful and transparent. So what we'd like for you to do now is go back to your definition and think about reassessing it, adding to it, expanding it. And we will have everyone who is willing share in just a moment, but we want to give you just a few minutes of 1-minute think time. Go back to whatever it is that you had written on whatever piece, either on your computer or on your notepad, and think about how these 3 principles may have changed or reassessed the definition you've come up with. I know a minute of quiet on Zoom feels like a long time, but we'll give you just a few more seconds to think through and reassess the definition or create a new definition if now you want to just throw out the whole thing. Just about 10 more seconds. So what we want to do next is we want to hear from all of you. But since there are 92 of you, a little less than 92 of you, we're going to use what's called a Padlet. If you've never used a Padlet before, it's just sort of like a virtual board, sticky board, where you can put up ideas. And what we want you to do is think about your definition and type out that definition into the Padlet in a link that Julie will share in just a moment. Now, how this works is you're going to see a screen much like the one that you see before you right now, and you need to find, I don't know why my arrow kind of scooted over, but you need to find that yellow round plus button. And when you click on that, you're going to see this. So it's formatted a little weird. What we want you to do is at the very top, the top section, you can feel free to write your name, or you can write your institution, you can write your initials, just whatever can identify you. Ignore the beehive elements in the middle. They're great, but they're a little too much for right now. And then type your response on the bottom, thinking about what your definition is. Those could even be bullet points. They don't need to be fully formulated thoughts, but this is just a way for us to get some ideas out there and share across disciplines and courses. When you're done, please push that giant pink publish button so that it doesn't disappear on you and so that it gets posted on the board. So Julie is going to go ahead and share that in the chat. And if for whatever reason you're having trouble posting, or you're just aversion to just yet another online thing, you can feel free to type your definition just in the Zoom chat. That's also okay. These are great. So I'm just going to pull out a few of these, and only because they're just appearing right in front of me, so no bias on anything specific. But I see that Sarah Goodman's written something about, rigor means that when my students walk out of my class, they should be able to summarize what we learned. And so if just writing equations on the board, they really quickly, without any time for anyone to think about it, then no one's really engaging with that material. So I really appreciate that. Really thinking about, by the time your students are walking out of your class at the end of the day, what do you really want them to be able to say about your class and do? I like Jennifer's comment, rigor is simultaneously structure and flexibility. We used a term in our CTL for throughout the whole pandemic, we want structured flexibility. And so that can look differently in different classes, but we want to be able to pivot. We got really good at that, but we also want to provide some structure, provide a sense of signposting for, okay, I'm not in my class with my professor anymore. What is it I'm supposed to do with myself? How am I supposed to be engaging with the material? And I'll read one more from Julian. Rigor could have mean having well-defined lessons and goals and being more explicit about how you assess those goals, while also allowing for critical thinking and discussion. So these learning goals aren't necessarily hard or easy, but are consistent with standards. So I really like also separating that they're not necessarily hard or easy, because that can look so different for so many different students. And so sometimes it could be challenging with students to say, well, if this feels easy to you, how are you going to take yourself to the next level? Or if this feels hard to you, how are you going to enjoy this process and engage with this? Because it feels hard for you, that's actually really, really a good sign that you might be critically thinking and engaging. And we really want that for our classroom. So if you want to, feel free to continue to type in some ideas, but we want to turn to our next Padlet, because we really want to think about all of these definitions are really important and really thoughtful, and we appreciate that. But we need to think about how we might apply that to our classroom context. So I will lead it back over to Julie for that.
Great. And so, usually when we do this workshop, it's a little bit smaller of a size and maybe a little bit more time. And so to make things a little bit more efficient, instead of asking you to first come up with sort of examples of inadequate definitions of rigor and ways that they're applied, and then thinking about how to improve upon them with a stronger definition of rigor, we're going to skip that first step, and we pulled out 4 different sort of examples of applications of inadequate definitions of rigor that have come up in others of our workshops that we've done in the past. And what we're asking you to do here is think about different ways that you might want to address one or all of these, depending on which ones you want to engage with. Although we do, in that 5th column, have a space where you can think about sort of like, what are other inadequate definitions of rigor, applications of rigor that you also want to sort of put on the table, either for yourself or for all of us. And so here's a link to this second Padlet. And so take a minute and try to brainstorm some ideas that you have for addressing these inadequate definitions of rigor. Yeah, already seeing some great ideas here. So exams with opportunities for resubmission and frequent formative assessments for the first one. For the second one, be explicitly nice. Yeah, I like that, like trying to be very specific about what students should continue doing. Realistic and actionable feedback. That's really, really helpful. That's awesome. So everyone gets a glow, something that they did well, and then also something to improve on. Yeah. great. Yeah, I'm seeing wise feedback. That's something that's in the literature. And so if you don't know that term, it's sort of that expression of high expectations for student work and both sort of confidence in their ability as well as concrete actionable steps that they can meet them. That's great. Rubrics helps in terms of gatekeeping, right? And not seeing grade quotas is something that's helpful, right? We'd love to see everyone have an A in the class. That may not be particularly realistic, but it's a wonderful thing to aspire to if we can. Yeah, and so really focusing in on sort of practice, project-based activities, things that are a little bit more authentic, right? Moving away sort of from that rote memorization, concept maps as a possibility. Groups and collaborative work. I think that's really helpful. As you know, when we ask students to work in groups, we're likely going to pick out deeper, harder topics for them to dig into. And so really trying to emphasize those more authentic tasks and more in line with the type of rigor that Culver and all were talking about as well. Great. All right, so I think we want to move on just to make sure that we have a little bit of time to engage with some questions at the end, but do feel free to keep adding and you'll have access to these at the end.
Great. Thank you so much for your contributions, everyone. We really appreciate it. And we really are excited to hear from you in just a few moments. We wanted to end with just going with an overview about these 3 principles that really, when we're talking about this question of rigor as inclusive practice, that we're really not seeing them as opposing forces, but thinking about the ways that they can inform one another. And we want to lead by 2 quotes that we found really important, because often when we hear or see this term rigor, there is an immediate sense of just clinching up of this is going to be tough, this is going to be stressful, and we want to get away from that because rigor doesn't have to necessarily be that way. And we thought that these 2 next quotes really encapsulate that. So the first is from a really great educator named Chris Emden. I really appreciate all of his books. They're fantastic. But he has a really great book where he's thinking about this question of rigor. And he says, to be an effective educator who creates academically rigorous instruction, one's teaching must be centered around the infusion of life and joy. Academic rigor is about being loud, proud, mobile, unpretentious, and challenged to take on whatever obstacles come one's way, even if they offer some challenge. And if you read his books, you really see about the variety of ways that he really encourages that in his classroom. The next is from our near and dear Bell Hooks, who, as many of you know, passed away recently. She was a formative educator in thinking about feminist thinking, as well as thinking about this question of intersections of race, class, gender. And I really appreciate in her book, Teaching to Transgress, this question of thinking about how we educate in a way that we practice freedom in the class. And so Bell says, I enter the classroom with the assumption that we must build community in order to create a climate of openness and intellectual rigor. And so very often, rigor can follow the building of a community in which students are encouraged to, in community, in kindness and in generosity, be able to challenge one another and not to do it in a way that's competitive or the way that is trying to really get each other down, but one that inspires this idea of engagement with one another because we care. And I like to tell my students, I really hate a class that I teach where I say something and everyone just agrees. No, please don't. Please use this as a space to disagree with me. Use this as a space to disagree with one another because it's boring when we all sit here and agree with one another. We don't want that. We will have a number of resources for you, and we will, of course, share these slides. But we also wanted to talk about a recent interview that CTL Executive Director Catherine Ross did with us. It's a podcast called Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning, where she addresses some of these ideas that we really hold and these beliefs that are continue to have a strong hold, which really we want to question. And so Julie and I were actually interviewed over the summer about this question of rigor and in its connection to inclusivity. And so you can click on that podcast there. But we also, the whole podcast series is really, really well done. With that, We have a link to references and further reading, and we really appreciate your time today as we lead into our Q&A. Just thank you for being here, and thank you for listening to us, and thank you for challenging yourselves to come up with a more rigorous definition of how you might think about rigor in your classroom.
Thank you so much, Jamiella and Julie. I even though I've heard a similar version a year ago, I find myself full of ideas. There are a lot of questions in the Slido, and they range in themes from things about, at MIT in particular, the ways rigor might be conceived in different disciplines, in STEM disciplines, and in SHAS, which is our School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and questions about how collaborative learning aligns with rigor, et cetera. But I want to highlight just a couple of these questions, and I'll put them in the chat as well as saying them out loud. The first is about the idea of belonging and how you balance not setting a deficit tone with acknowledging that struggle is common and not a sign that you don't belong.
I can jump in maybe, and then Jamiella, if you have something to add. But I mean, I think this is such a great question, and I love it, and I love talking about this because I really feel strongly that, you know, I think we should talk about struggle more. Like, this is a normal thing. This is part of being rigorous, right? And you know, and the paper that I talked about in terms of you know, thinking about sort of the psychological impacts of deficit, you know, part of that is thinking about, like, nobody else thinks anybody else struggles, right? And so I think trying to make it open, trying to say that, you know, and like figuring out how to help students interpret particular situations, right? And interpret that struggle means that you're learning, right? And I think trying to help students reframe that experience and redefine it for themselves is something that's really important. And so talking about your own struggles, talking about, you know, people who've struggled to succeed, I think all of these things that sort of normalize struggle, because a student sitting in a large lecture hall is going to assume that all the other 200 people sitting with them is not struggling in the same way that they are. And so just trying to make that sort of visible and something that's talked about, I think, can help to really normalize it and sort of produce that sense of belonging.
Yeah, that's great, Julie. And I love that phrase in the chat, Paul, about productive struggle. And then also, I was going to also mention, because I saw a couple of you write in the Padlet this question of desirable difficulty. And I love that, because we want our classes, and we want to design assignments and projects and things that are what we call desirably difficult. So that means that it's not a question of we want everyone to feel comfortable and everyone to feel okay. We actually want to raise the stakes, but we don't want that discomfort to be an impediment to learning. And so an undesirable difficulty would be to put students in a situation that is so stressful, that is so challenging, that they're no longer able to learn. And sometimes that could be cold calling. Sometimes that could be just an assignment that is just made to be impossible. It could just look like a variety of different things. I think what's challenging about it is also the messages that we send when we make things difficult, because students have come from other classes, they've come from other contexts, so they perceive that difficulty based on their life experience. And so communicating to students that you're not making it difficult for no reason, you're making it difficult for X reasons, and you want them to engage with that difficulty and to lean into that difficulty, and then maybe giving them some options to tap out when it becomes unproductive or when learning isn't happening. I also want to go back to something that Julie said about vulnerability. I think it's always a good idea to share one's own story, to share one's own struggles with students. I would be careful, though. One is, there is a lot of research that says that some inclusive teaching practices are not inclusive for the teacher. And so I say that for me personally, as a woman of color, when I'm teaching, sometimes when I'm being extra vulnerable with my students, saying, this was really hard, this didn't go so well, it gets thrown back in my face. It gets perceived as, oh, well, this teacher really can't do it. So I say that to say that you can choose whatever level of vulnerability you want to share with students, but it's equally effective to have students be vulnerable with one another. And so there's a professor here at Penn who's just really well known for an exercise he does with his students, which is, it's a midterm, where on the midterm he asks students to write and share where their struggles were, why they struggled. and thinking about, like, what advice would you give to future students? And then he says, is it okay if I share this with future students? Sometimes they're not okay with sharing it, but most of them are. And then he gathers up that stuff and shares it with future students so that it's the students communicating to one another what their struggles were and normalizing that process.
Thank you so much, Julie and Jamiella. There is one more question that we don't have time to address. It's 2 o'clock, but I wanted to put it in the chat. If anyone has time, they're welcome to kind of crowdsource and share some. But I think some mindsets and strategies you already addressed with things like normalizing struggle, but also being very conscious of your positionality and how the kind of intersectional influences of your teaching strategies and positionality. I want to thank you both so much for just a really generative and exciting conversation. What I hope, again, is the beginning of a conversation. And thank you all for attending, engaging. I learned a lot from looking through your Padlet responses, and I look forward to talking more soon.
Thanks everyone. Until again.
Thank you.